Hello, and thank you for choosing Perception Media. I am your hostess, the Cynic Geek, and today I'm going to talk about the evolution of vampires in cinema. I'm talking about this on Valentine's Day because, oddly enough, the OG, sort of, Dracula movie that came out in 1931 starring Bela Lugosi actually came out Valentine's Day 1931, which I thought was really fun. So I thought, I watched a lot of vampire movies, you know. I, at one time, many moons ago, was a teenage girl. And like every teenage girl, especially one who is from the Puget Sounds area of Washington, had a vampire obsession. And I didn't just stop at Dracula, my friends. No. I went all the way back to Carmilla, which does predate Bram Stoker's Dracula as a vampire novel. I even went to more obscure things like Maldoror, which is about a vampire? The Antichrist? It mentions vampires. I don't know what this is about. It's a 300-page French surrealist poem. If you know what it's about, please let me in on that knowledge, because I don't. And then, of course, I got into the Vampire Bible. I haven't read all 15, but I do own them all. That can lift it. Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles. So, you know, I've read a lot, I've watched a lot. At one point, I did own Lestat, The Vampire Lestat as a graphic novel. I've since lost it. I'm very sad. But I have a lot of vampire stuff. I've even recreated this very famous photo called The Vampire. And up here, I blurred his face out, you know, because respect. I don't know if he'd be cool with me showing his face. And I recreated a whole bunch of vampire photos, but this is the only one I'm going to show because I really like this one from Francis Ford Coppola's. But anyway, I'm digressing and getting into a lot of like why I'm talking about vampires. So let me just go ahead and start. And of course, when we start, we have to start with Nosferatu, which came out in 1922. It is a wonderful example of German expressionism and is honestly probably the most famous silent film ever. If you ask anyone what silent film they've seen or know, the answer you will most likely get is Nosferatu. It was not remade, but it does have a film based off specifically Nosferatu called Shadow of a Vampire, which came out in 2000 and is very meta and dark, and it basically postulates that Count Orlok, who is technically Dracula, but they couldn't call him that because of rights issues, what if he was a real vampire and he goes around killing people? I highly recommend it. It's weird. It's funny, it's creepy, it's kind of like Bewitched, the remake they did of that, but it's about Nosferatu, so obviously it's better. Then we get into like the Universal monster movies, and of course we all know that Universal had the first shared universe. You know, you have, not counting Lon Chaney's Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera, but if you get into like Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman, Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, and most importantly, as I already showed before, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, which honestly, this kind of set the tone for what people would consider Dracula to look like and Dracula to sound like. A lot of TV shows have vampire episodes, and almost all of them, if they're not typically a vampire show, like Buffy, will have, The Hunger is an example of a movie that did this, but they will have Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus in it. Bela Lugosi is, I would say, the most famous vampire, or person who played a vampire anyway. But it's actually funny that was the only time he played Dracula. There were quite a few Universal sequels, but they were typically played by John Carradine or Lon Chaney Jr. The only time he reprised his role as Dracula is in 1948 when Abbott and Costello made Frankenstein, which also had Lon Chaney Jr. as a Wolfman in it, and had somebody else playing Frankenstein, although I don't really remember who. Maybe I'll do a history of Frankenstein. So as I said, Universal does have quite a few sequels, and they have in 36, Dracula's Daughter, Son of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, and House of Dracula. But after that, we get into the Universal monster movies, and this is where we get the famous, the wonderful, the creepy, the enticing Christopher Lee. I'm trying to show this without having any amount of reflection. This might be better. And this is one of the sequels, and they have many. Christopher Lee has played Dracula more than anybody else, and he started in Universal. Universal. He started in Hammer Horror. So Hammer Horror had typically Christopher Lee as Dracula and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, and they had so many Dracula movies, and they also had a whole bunch of movies that weren't Dracula films. And if you watch, for instance, Tim Burton films, specifically like Sleepy Hollow, when you see that real bright red, kind of like my lipstick, that is owed to Hammer Horror. They did that, I don't know, I guess so they could have a lower rating, but they had so many movies. And the first Dracula movie was 1958, Horror of Dracula. They had Brides of Dracula, that one didn't have Dracula in it. They had Dracula, Prince of Darkness, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, that's the poster I just showed you. They have Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, Dracula 1972 AD, which this is where Peter Cushing is reprising his role as Van Helsing, and it's a little more fun. Then we have The Satanic Rites of Dracula, which is kind of like Eyes Wide Shut, but with vampires, which is amazing. We have one of my personal favorites in 1974, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, and this is where Christopher Lee decided not to come back to reprise his role, and Peter Cushing is going, and it's kind of like Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, but with vampires, which again is amazing. And Hammer Horror had a whole bunch of other films, like I said before, that weren't a part of the Dracula series, like Kiss the Vampire, Vampire Circus, which is a really weird, bizarre, fun movie. Countess Dracula, which is based off the Countess Elizabeth Bathory. And then we have like Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, which is more of an action vampire movie. So we're starting to move away a little bit from the horror aspect of vampirism and starting to open up the genre of vampires not just being horror movies. And then of course in the 70s we also have some Hammer Horror movies that are based on Carmilla, which as I said is a novel that predates Dracula, although there haven't been as many movies made based on her book. I can't pronounce her name. Fano. There have been at least 36 films or TV titles that have to list her as being based on her book. And for Hammer, they have Vampire Lovers, Lust for a Vampire, and Twins of Evil. I recommend Twins of Evil. It's like black magic and weird, and what else do you need in a movie? But oftentimes when you have these movies, it's usually going to depict more of a lesbian relationship, which take that or leave that, up to you. But for Vampire Lovers, it's kind of like The Picture of Dorian Gray, but with vampires, which I think is a really great match, and The Picture of Dorian Gray is my personal favorite novel of all time, so I think that's kind of I like it. It's interesting. And in this, we kind of see in the 70s, of course, there's more sexual liberation, and they're exploring these themes more. So I think that's when we started getting more of these novels based on, I can't pronounce her name, based on Carmilla. And then we get, Christopher Lee also did a Spanish film, Count Dracula in 1970, that is not part of Hammer Horror. And this one kind of depicts, Dracula more as an old man who becomes young when he drinks blood, and that idea gets more and more prominent in the 80s. We have one of my personal films in 1973, which is Lamora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, and it's so fun. And this is going to be the first time we see an entire town being kind of infected with vampirism, and we also have two factions of vampires. There's two different types. So there's the types that are like the children of Lamora, and they're like normal vampire would be. They're just they're like people, but they drink blood. And then they have this other faction that's kind of a bit more like a zombie or a ghoul, and they're more mindless and bloodthirsty. It's a really bizarre, dreamlike film that has a focus on like purity and innocence, and at the end is open to interpretation and done in the best way. Some movies, they're open to interpretation and they suck. Other movies, like this one, is a perfect example of how to leave a movie open to interpretation. And it's really cool, and we have a vampire queen, and that's always fantastic. Then we get from 1966 to 1971, Dark Shadows. And I have a review of the entire series. I haven't done the films. This is House of Dark Shadows, the first movie, which ended up kind of taking the show off the air. This is one of the rare TV shows that got a film based on it while it was airing, and I think kind of set a precedence of why you shouldn't do that, because after that the ratings dropped, because people saw that the movie was far more violent than the show, and the show was predominantly watched by children, so parents decided they didn't want their children to watch it anymore. Or, I mean, there's other speculation as to why the show ended, but essentially, it's Barnabas Collins is a vampire, and he came into the show when they realized it was going to go off in the air back in 1967, but when he came on the show, the ratings spiked, and so it was allowed to go on for, 4 more years, and they realized they can't have the vampire be the bad guy the whole time. He's the main character now. So they made him a reluctant vampire, and he's, as far as I can tell, he's the first reluctant vampire, and obviously that set a precedent more towards the turn of the 20th century when we start getting more and more reluctant vampires, but he was the first, and I think the best. And of course, Dark Shadows did have a 1991 brief remake of the TV show, and then Tim Burton did that abomination of a pile of garbage that I won't even talk about. 1974, Andy Warhol produced the film Blood for Dracula with Udo Kier as Dracula, and this is one of my all-time favorite vampire films. It is bloody, it is just violent, it is sexual and crazy, and there are themes of sexuality, status, economic position. It's just, gory. It's very, very, very 70s. They talk a lot of about like communism, and they talk a lot about, again, as I mentioned before, like purity, and that's generally a running theme in vampire films. And at this point, we're going to start to go away from having all of these films be predominantly in Europe, and we're going to start getting more of them not being timepieces, being modern day pieces, and we're going to have more of them starting to transition to them being, again, not only relegated to horror movies. And this is a perfect example. And if you aren't a huge fan of George Romero, I doubt you've ever actually heard of it. It's called Martin, and it came out in 1978. And it is tragically overlooked. It's a psychological take on vampires. And Martin is this young boy who goes to live with his elderly cousin, and his cousin believes he's a vampire. And Martin kind of thinks he's a vampire too, but whether he is or isn't, he is a rapist and a murderer, but he doesn't have fangs. But he does drink blood. And there's this idea of, is this like a sexual fetish? Is he a vampire? Is his cousin crazy? Because his uncle, throws holy water on him and it doesn't work, and he holds a cross up to him and it doesn't work. And Martin says specifically, there is no magic. And so there's this idea of, is this a real thing, or is he a monster, like literally a monster, like a vampire, or is he a monster or just a bad person? And we're going to see a movie kind of like this about 10 years later that I'll get to, that I'm sure you've seen a meme of. Then 1979 has my personal favorite, Dracula, which was starring Frank Langella. And it's just entitled Dracula. And we have Laurence Olivier as Van Helsing and Donald Pleasance as Seward. And this time we have Dracula coming to England. And it's kind of the same old thing that plays out in most of these movies. But this one, the focus is more on the romance, and they've switched Mina and Lucy's character. And I really, really love that. That now we're starting to get more romantic vampires, and less, of these just mindless monsters who want blood. But of course, we gotta throw Stephen King in here, because Stephen King's everywhere, and we have 1979's Salem's Lot, which was adapted into a TV movie by, of all people, Tobe Hooper, who did Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Poltergeist. There was a 2004 remake, and there was a sequel to this in 1987. It takes place in Maine, and again, it's kind of like Lemoore, where we have a town that gets invaded, and they all become vampires. It's a bit nihilistic, as there's only 2 survivors, and it kind of ends with the understanding that we know that these 2 aren't going to survive very long. From there, we get our first vampire spoof, our first vampire comedy that I could find. 1979's Love at First Bite, which it's Dracula, but Dracula's in America. He's in New York. It's modern day. He is, modern day 1979. And it's just a funny vampire movie. I personally like Mel Brooks's one, but we'll get to that a little later. And that brings us to 1983's The Hunger with Susan Sarandon and David Bowie. And did I mention Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus is playing in the beginning? And that sets the tone. It is, again, kind of a surrealist, sexual movie that the theme is, beauty and youth and love and desire, and it's a little crazy. It's off the wall. Oh my gosh, my video is so long. I'm gonna have to make this 2 parts. Okay, so here we get into all this that is crazy. Again, it's the early 80s, so there's still these kinds of themes of like sexual liberation that we have. This vampire woman is empowered, and she has David Bowie as her pet, and essentially she feeds off him, and it lets her stay young, and it lets him stay young, but she doesn't really want him anymore. She's not really in love with him anymore, and so he ends up developing insomnia, which causes him to age very, very rapidly. So he goes to see Susan Sarandon, who's a doctor, and Susan Sarandon goes to investigate because she thinks he's crazy, and then she learns that he is in fact like a vampire, and the vampire turns Susan Sarandon, but there's all this craziness happens, and there's this lady-on-lady action that I wish wasn't overly sexualized the way it is, but it is, and I don't know, it's kind of cool. I do like that this vampire, I think she's like 2,000 years old, and she's straight out of Egypt, which is cool, and it kind of reminds me of Anne Rice's Queen of the Damned. This is more of a succubus than a vampire film, so it's not like a strict vampire story. And stay tuned for part 2, where I'm going to start in 1985 and go to modern day times. But there has been a steep and noticeable transition in vampire films going from 1922 to 1983, where I'm leaving off, where we're getting less monster, more romance, less we're getting the same amount of desire. It's always sexualized as vampirism is. But we are getting to see vampires be a little bit more human, or if not, we're getting to see more in the terms of genre outside of horror films. And I think that's cool, and it's only going to get more crazy in part 2, so stay tuned.